It was an evening no one in Shreveport, Louisiana would ever forget. The church fellowship hall, usually a place of quiet Bible study and Sunday potlucks, was filled with murmurs and the soft scraping of folding chairs. But tonight, something was different. A sense of anticipation hung in the air. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump. His unmistakable presence commanded attention, yet the energy in the room was uncharacteristically subdued. Then, breaking the silence, came a single question, one so pure, so unexpected, that it stopped everything. An 8-year-old girl had spoken. Her words, simple yet profound, forced Trump to pause. What happened next stunned the entire crowd. In that moment, he shared a deeply personal story, one of faith, loss, and redemption. And by the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. This is Journey of Stories, where we bring you the most powerful and moving real-life moments. If this story touches your heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. His unmistakable presence was impossible to ignore. His signature hand gestures, the familiar orange-tinged complexion. But tonight, something was different. He wasn't the fiery, commanding figure people had come to expect. Instead, he seemed subdued, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The audience was a mix of families, retirees, and local residents, each drawn here out of curiosity, hoping to hear what he had to say. Yet, among them, one figure stood out, not because of size or status, but because of something deeper. In the midst of the crowd sat an 8-year-old girl. She was small, quiet, yet unmistakably present. Dressed in her best Sunday dress, she clutched a worn leather-bound Bible against her chest. It was old, its gold lettering faded, but to her, it was priceless, a treasured gift from her late grandmother. Her eyes never wavered, her grip never loosened. She wasn't here just to listen. She was here for something more. And soon, the question she had been carrying in her heart would change everything. The Bible in her hands was more than just a book. Its pages were worn, its gold lettering faded with time. It had been passed down from her grandmother, now gone, but never forgotten. It was a piece of her, a reminder of the wisdom and love she had left behind. Her mother, seated beside her, had whispered to her before they arrived, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough. And only if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart pounding. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, scribbling her question in the corners of her notebook during recess, whispering it to herself in the dark as she lay in bed at night. This wasn't just a child's curiosity. It wasn't about impressing anyone or seeking attention. This question had weight. It had meaning. It had lived in her heart long before she stepped into this room. As the evening unfolded, Trump spoke as he always did, about policies, achievements, and the future of America. The crowd clapped at the expected moments, nodding along. But to Lily, none of that mattered. She was waiting, holding on, preparing for the moment when she would finally gather the courage to ask the one question that had never stopped echoing in her mind. And when that moment came, the entire room would change. Trump continued speaking about achievements, about the future of America, the usual themes. The crowd responded as expected, clapping at the right moments, nodding in agreement. But the energy was different. It lacked the electricity of his usual rallies. There was no roaring excitement, no thunderous applause. And yet, in the midst of it all, Lily sat still, waiting. Her small hands gripped the worn edges of her Bible, tightening with every passing minute. She had come here for one reason. And as much as she tried to steady herself, the pounding in her chest only grew stronger. Then, finally, the moment arrived. The floor opened for questions. A line quickly formed, filled with adults eager to speak. Some asked about local issues, others pressed him on national policies. A few even took the opportunity to throw in a compliment about his signature red tie. Lily hesitated. She felt so small compared to the crowd, so invisible. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, making her shrink further into her seat. Then, She felt it. A gentle nudge from her mother. A silent reminder. A push of encouragement. This was her moment. She could either let it pass or stand up and take it. She knew. This was her moment. Lily's legs trembled as she rose from her seat, feeling the weight of every step before she even took one. Her heart pounded so hard, so fast, she was convinced the entire room could hear it. The line ahead of her stretched on, seeming impossibly long. But as she took her first cautious step forward, something strange happened. The noise in the room began to fade. People started to notice. A small girl, barely 8 years old, clutching an oversized, time-worn Bible against her chest, stepping forward with quiet determination. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Who is she? What is she doing? One by one, heads turned. Conversations hushed. The usual hum of town hall chatter melted away, replaced by something far more powerful, a silent, collective anticipation. Then, at last, it was her turn. Trump's gaze lowered, meeting hers. For a moment, something in his expression changed. The familiar bravado faded, if only slightly. He studied her, this little girl who had captured the attention of an entire room. Then, in a voice softer than anyone expected, he asked, "And what's your question, young lady?" Lily swallowed hard. Her hands gripped the Bible tighter, her knuckles turning white. This was it. The question she had carried in her heart for so long, the one that had kept her up at night, the one she had rehearsed over and over, was about to be spoken aloud. And in the next few seconds, everything would change. Lily's knuckles turned white as she clutched the Bible tighter, as if drawing strength from the worn leather cover. Her voice trembled, but she refused to let it break. Then she spoke. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The words, though soft, struck like a thunderclap. The room fell into absolute silence. Not a whisper, not a shuffle. Even the faintest breath seemed to disappear into the stillness. Every eye in the hall darted between the girl and Trump, the weight of her question pressing down on everyone like an invisible force. For a man known for his quick comebacks and rapid-fire responses, the pause that followed felt almost unnatural. Trump didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply looked at her. Then his eyes shifted to the Bible in her hands. His gaze lingered on its worn pages, its faded gold lettering. And in that moment, something in him changed. His usual bravado, the sharp confidence that had built his career, softened. Just slightly. For the first time that night, it seemed like he was the one searching for the right words. Before he could speak, the air in the room seemed to shift. It thickened, charged with something unspoken, something heavy. A quiet tension spread through the crowd, pulling everyone to the edge of their seats. Trump's silence was almost deafening. For a man who had built his career on quick comebacks, sharp retorts, and unwavering confidence, this pause was unnatural, uncharacteristic, unforgettable. He stared at Lily. Not just at her question, not just at the little girl standing before him, but at something deeper, something that had caught him off guard. His usual bravado faded. The larger-than-life presence, the towering persona, the man who had faced the fiercest critics without hesitation, was suddenly still. His gaze flickered back to the Bible in her hands, its worn leather, its faded gold lettering, so small yet holding so much weight. His lips parted, as if to answer, but no words came. Lily shifted under the room's collective gaze, her small frame somehow looking even smaller beneath the weight of the moment. Yet she didn't step back. She didn't waver. She had asked her question, and now she waited. The entire room did, because whatever happened next would change everything. Lily's question had not been meant to challenge. It wasn't meant to provoke. It was something far more powerful, honest. It came from a place of deep yearning, from a heart too young to be burdened with such a weight, yet wise enough to ask it anyway. And somehow, that sincerity, raw, unfiltered, and pure, was louder than any political debate, any campaign promise, any shouted slogan. The room remained still, not just silent, but hushed, as if the air itself had stopped moving. No creaking chairs, no muffled coughs, no restless shifting. Nothing. It was as though the very walls of the church hall had leaned in to listen. Then, finally, he moved. Trump raised his hand slightly, a subtle motion, almost unnoticeable. But it was there. A moment to steady himself. A pause to collect something that had momentarily slipped beyond his grasp. His fingers brushed against the podium as he leaned forward just slightly. And then, at last, he spoke. "That's a big question," he said. His voice was lower now, steadier, more deliberate. And for the first time that night, he wasn't speaking to the crowd. He was speaking to her. And it's not one I've always had the answer to. The words hung in the air, heavier than anyone expected. For a man known for his unwavering confidence, for always having an answer, always having control, this was different. He was admitting uncertainty. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it quickly faded as Trump's gaze returned to Lily. Something in his expression shifted again. The hard edges softened. The commanding presence eased, just slightly. And in its place, something almost paternal emerged. "When I was about your age," he continued, his voice quieter now, "I had a lot of questions about God, too." He let out a small breath, almost as if the memory itself had pulled him back in time. "My parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring up at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." For a moment he paused again, not out of hesitation, but reflection. His eyes swept across the audience, as if searching for something, or someone who had once shared that same doubt. And in that moment, the crowd wasn't just watching a speech anymore. They were watching a man wrestle with something real, something human. Trump's gaze swept over the crowd as though searching their faces, measuring their reaction. His hand rested on the podium, fingers tapping lightly against the wood, not out of impatience, but thought, reflection. Then he spoke again. "My father used to tell me something," he said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "He told me that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you're afraid you'll fall. But you keep climbing, because there's something up there worth reaching for." He let the words settle, his expression unreadable, as if weighing their meaning even now. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. A brief pause. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet. A faint chuckle rippled through the audience. The tension, thick as it had been, loosened just slightly. But Lily didn't laugh. She wasn't here for amusement. She wasn't here for small talk. Her gaze remained fixed on him, her fingers still gripping her Bible. She was waiting for the real answer. And something about that kept Trump talking. Lily didn't smile. She didn't nod along like the others. She didn't relax at the chuckles that rippled through the crowd. Her eyes stayed locked on him, unwavering. She wasn't looking for a clever anecdote or a rehearsed line. She was waiting for the real answer. Trump seemed to notice. He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting again, lower, softer, more honest. "But as I got older," he began, his voice quieter now, as if speaking less to the crowd and more to himself. "Life threw a lot of challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "And in those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me." The room remained still, not just listening, hanging on every word. Sometimes I was angry at him. A murmur ran through the crowd, It wasn't something people expected to hear, not from him. Other times, I thought maybe he'd given up on me altogether. There was no bravado in his voice now. No carefully crafted speech. This wasn't politics. This was personal. And for the first time, the audience wasn't just hearing him. They were feeling what he was saying. This wasn't a speech. This wasn't a rehearsed response or a political statement. This was something raw, something real. Trump took a breath, his voice steadying, his tone firming up just slightly. "But I'll tell you this," he said. The room leaned in. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized something." A pause. Faith isn't about always having the answers. His words cut through the silence, landing with the weight of experience. It's about believing that even when you don't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work. He glanced back at Lily. Her grip on the Bible had loosened just a little. Her wide eyes shimmered under the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights, but she didn't look away. She was still listening, still waiting. Trump met her gaze and spoke again, this time slower. "And God, to me, He is that purpose." Another beat of silence. "He's the reminder that even when we fall..." His voice didn't waver. His words weren't rushed, because in that moment he wasn't just talking to Lily, he was talking to everyone. "Even when we fail, we're not done." Trump's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough. He's the one who keeps telling us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of something unspoken, something that reached beyond words. Then, before the moment could fully settle, Lily's eyes welled with tears. The first tear fell quietly, slipping down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible even tighter against her chest. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, sensing that something was happening, something extraordinary. But Lily wasn't crying out of sadness. She wasn't overwhelmed by the attention. She was feeling something deeper, something she hadn't even realized she had been waiting for. Trump's words still lingered in the air, wrapping around her like an invisible thread. And then her small shoulders began to tremble. Not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of something she couldn't yet name, but knew was real. The crowd noticed. Whispers began to swell, hushed yet urgent, rippling through the hall like a quiet wave. And yet, no one dared to interrupt. Not a single voice broke the moment. Not a single movement shattered the stillness. Lily's mother leaned over, her hand instinctively finding her daughter's back, a gentle reassurance in the middle of something neither of them had expected. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. This wasn't about feeling small, or nervous, or overwhelmed. This was something far deeper. Trump had spoken words she hadn't known she needed to hear, and in doing so, he had touched a part of her heart that she had long, quietly guarded. Something shifted in the air. Trump noticed. His expression changed, his usual sharpness replaced by something else, something uncharacteristically subdued. For a man who had stood before countless crowds, who had commanded stadiums and debates with unwavering confidence, this moment was different, because in the face of one little girl's silent tears, he didn't have to say anything more. Trump took a slow step forward. His voice, so often commanding and forceful, softened to something almost gentle. "What's your name?" he asked. For a moment Lily hesitated, her throat tight, her emotions pressing against her like a wave too big to hold back. Lily," she stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Trump nodded, a faint smile forming. "That's a beautiful name." Lily blinked up at him, her tear-filled eyes never looking away. "You know, Lily," he continued, his tone thoughtful, "sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest ones to answer, and sometimes Those questions remind us of what really matters. Lily nodded, not because she was trying to be polite, not because she was intimidated, but because she understood. Because, in some unspoken way, so did he. She swallowed hard, her voice still small but steady. "My grandma used to say that too," she whispered. "She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." Trump's expression flickered. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed across his face. Something that wasn't rehearsed, wasn't calculated. A mix of admiration and something deeper. Understanding. Because this wasn't just about a little girl's question anymore. This was about something much, much bigger. He took a deep breath, turning his attention back to the crowd. "You know, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us?" It's not an easy question, because it makes us look inward. It forces us to face our fears, our doubts, and our flaws. The room was utterly still, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. For a moment, it felt as though Lily wasn't just a little girl with a Bible. She was a symbol of something much bigger. Her courage had shifted the tone of the entire evening. Trump paused for a moment, then continued. "In our world today, we're always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We look for power, success, or money to fill the gaps. But they don't. The real answers? They're the ones that make us uncomfortable. The ones that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? Who am I when no one else is looking?" The room seemed to absorb every word he spoke, as if each one held the power to change something deep within. He looked back at Lily, his voice softening. "Thank you, Lily, for reminding us of that. Sometimes the hardest questions are the ones that matter the most." Lily's eyes met his, her small figure still trembling, but now with a sense of quiet understanding. She didn't speak, but her gaze spoke volumes. A deep connection between the child and the man who had stood before countless crowds, yet now, in this moment, seemed to share something real, something profoundly human. Trump's voice softened even further, carrying a weight that resonated through the room. It's easy to get lost in the noise of the world, to get caught up in all the things that seem important. But it takes courage to ask the right questions. It takes courage to look inward and search for what truly matters. His words lingered in the air, settling over the crowd like a blanket. The usual political rhetoric that filled town halls had been replaced by something far more personal, something that transcended party lines or agendas. This was about faith, about redemption, about understanding that life, in its deepest sense, isn't just about the power or the position, but about finding purpose and meaning in the simplest of things. "Thank you, Lily," Trump said, his voice barely above a whisper, though the entire room hung on his every word. Sometimes it's the smallest voices that speak the loudest, and tonight you've reminded us all of something important. Faith isn't just about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and trusting that there's something bigger at work. You've done that, and I think we'll all remember this moment. The room, still heavy with emotion, erupted in a quiet but heartfelt applause. Lily, blinking away tears, finally allowed herself to smile. It wasn't the kind of applause one might expect at a typical political event. No loud cheers or shouting. Just a sincere, appreciative round of claps that reflected the moment's significance. A little girl had asked a question, and in doing so, she had transformed an ordinary event into a lesson in faith, vulnerability, and the power of simple honesty. Lily's mother, who had been sitting beside her, gently wiped away a tear, watching her daughter with an expression of pure pride. What had started as a moment of quiet courage had turned into something far greater, a reminder for everyone in that room about the importance of faith, of listening, and of staying grounded in what truly matters. Trump took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of the people who had come to hear him speak. This wasn't just another town hall. It was a moment of shared humanity, where everyone, no matter their background or beliefs, had been given a glimpse of something bigger than themselves. And for that, they would never forget the question asked by a little girl with an old Bible, and the unexpected answer that followed. had thickened with anticipation. Trump cleared his throat and took another step back from the podium, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around him. "You know," he began, his voice more reflective now, "I've stood in front of crowds all over the world. I've delivered countless speeches. But this moment, this is different." He paused, eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right words, the words that would bring everything full circle. "It's easy to stand up and talk about success and power," he continued, "but what really matters, what really defines us, is how we handle the moments that test us, the moments that break us, that make us question everything we thought we knew." The crowd listened intently, leaning in slightly, as though the air itself had become charged with his words. There was no rush, no frantic applause, just an overwhelming silence that begged for more. "I wasn't always sure of what I believed," Trump said, his voice softer now, vulnerable in a way few had seen before. "In fact, I spent a long time running from faith. There were days when I thought I was better off without it. But over the years, through struggles, failures, and losses, I came to realize that faith is what anchors us when everything else is falling apart." Lily's eyes stayed fixed on him, her hands now gently clutching her Bible, almost as if the words were woven into the very fabric of her being. It was clear she understood this, perhaps in a way only a child could, pure, unfiltered, and completely without doubt. Trump's voice dropped even further, now filled with a quiet sincerity that had not been present earlier. "I've been through some dark times, and I know what it feels like to wonder if God's listening, to feel lost, to feel as though no one could possibly understand the weight of what you're going through." There was a deep pause as Trump looked around the room, his gaze softening. "But you know, the one thing that always brought me back, that gave me the strength to keep going, was the belief that no matter how far we fall, no matter how lost we feel, God is there to lift us back up." The room was so still that one could almost hear a pin drop. The crowd, who had come expecting the usual political banter, was now swept into a story that transcended politics. It was no longer about policies or platforms. It was about redemption, growth, and faith. Trump glanced down at Lily, her tear-streaked face now glowing with a quiet sense of understanding. "Lily," he said, his voice warm, "you've reminded me that faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we live. And it's in those moments of doubt and fear that we truly learn what faith is." With that, he nodded to the crowd, a silent acknowledgement that this conversation was far from over, but that they had all just taken a step together, a step towards something bigger than they had ever anticipated, something real, something human. The room seemed to hold its breath, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Every word Trump spoke now carried an undeniable weight, a vulnerability that was rare for him. "There was a time," he continued, his voice now quieter, almost reflective, "when I thought I had it all. Success, power, the respect of people. I had everything I thought I needed to be happy. But one event, one moment, showed me that control is an illusion. Life can turn on you in an instant, and when it does, you're left standing, wondering how you got here." He took another slow breath, his eyes briefly glancing at Lily, who was still clutching her Bible, as though it was her anchor in the storm of his words. "When I was younger, I had big dreams. Dreams that I thought I could accomplish by sheer willpower," Trump said, the softness in his voice growing deeper with every word. "But there was one moment, a moment of real loss, that made me see just how much I didn't know. It was a point in my life when everything seemed to fall apart, when everything I'd worked for seemed to slip through my fingers." The audience remained silent, captivated by the raw honesty unfolding before them. Even those who had come to hear a speech about policy were now sitting on the edge of their seats, entranced by the depth of this unexpected story. "I had the world in my hands," Trump continued, his gaze growing distant as if he were reliving that moment. But then, everything changed. A business failure, a personal loss, and I realized that all the money, the power, the recognition in the world couldn't protect me from the harsh realities of life. Lily's eyes never left him. The young girl, holding on to her grandmother's Bible, understood more than most could fathom. She could see that Trump was not just a political figure standing in front of them. He was a man who had wrestled with the same doubts and fears that everyone else had faced. Trump looked at her again, his voice softer, tinged with a sense of regret. That's when I realized that the real power in life isn't about control, or success, or how much you have. It's about what you do when everything seems to be falling apart. It's about how you find the strength to keep going, even when it feels like you've lost it all. He paused once more, the crowd hanging on his every word. That was the turning point for me. It was the moment I realized I didn't have all the answers, and that maybe, just maybe, I didn't need to. The room remained still, the silence heavy with the realization that the man speaking wasn't just a politician or a businessman, but someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, changed. Trump finally straightened up, his expression shifting back to something more familiar, but still holding a hint of that vulnerability. And it was in that moment of weakness, that moment of uncertainty, that I found something I'd been searching for all along. I found faith. His eyes met Lily's again, a sense of connection passing between them. And that, Lily, he said, his voice firm now but with a tenderness to it, is what God means to me. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as though everyone was finally allowed to process the depth of the story they had just witnessed. Lily, her Bible still tightly held in her hands, wiped away the last of her tears and offered him a quiet, appreciative smile. In that moment, both of them, the young girl and the former president, had shared something deeply human, something far beyond politics or public life. It was a moment of truth, of faith, and of redemption that no one in that room would ever forget. The air in the room grew heavier, a collective hush settling over the crowd as they sensed the deep pain in Trump's voice. It was clear this was no ordinary story. This was a moment of raw, unfiltered vulnerability. When Fred passed away, Trump continued, his voice breaking slightly, I was angry. Angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. I didn't understand why he had to suffer the way he did, why things didn't turn out better for him. I wanted answers, but the ones I got, they weren't the ones I wanted. He paused, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before he regained his composure. The room was still, the silence hanging heavy, as though the crowd knew they were about to hear something profoundly personal, something not usually shared in the public eye. I'd always prided myself on being able to fix things, Trump said, his gaze steady but pained. But with Fred, no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, it just wasn't enough. I couldn't save him. The weight of his words seemed to settle on the crowd like a thick fog. The man who had once projected an image of invincibility was now sharing his deepest sorrow, and in doing so, he had allowed everyone in that room to see a side of him they'd never expected. I was angry, Trump repeated, his voice quieter now, almost reflecting the inner turmoil he had carried for so long. But in that anger, something changed. I realized that grief and loss and anger, those are real. They're a part of life. But they don't define us. What defines us is how we move forward, how we find the strength to keep going even when we don't understand why things happen the way they do. His eyes flicked back to Lily, her small figure still sitting at the front of the room, her Bible resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on him. Trump's gaze softened, and he took a deep breath, his shoulders loosening slightly. It wasn't until I hit that point of anger and pain that I finally understood something important, he said slowly. I understood that it's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to question and to be angry and to not understand. What matters is that you keep going. What matters is that you find a way to heal, even if it takes time. And that's when I found my faith. The room remained quiet, the impact of his words resonating with everyone present. The crowd had come to hear a politician speak, but they had just witnessed a man struggling with loss, finding peace in the most unexpected way. Trump's expression grew more resolute. "I'm not saying it's easy," he said, his voice gaining strength. "In fact, it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But I can tell you this, when you find faith, even in the darkest moments, it gives you the strength to keep climbing." Lily's eyes glistened, her small face full of understanding. She knew the pain of loss in her own way, having lost her grandmother not long ago. But now she saw something in Trump, something she hadn't expected. She saw the man, not the politician, the human being who had faced his own struggles and emerged with a sense of faith that had carried him through. Trump nodded once more, a subtle gesture of gratitude. "Thank you for asking me that question, Lily," he said, his voice firm but kind. "It's questions like yours that remind us all of the things we forget, what really matters in life." The room remained silent for a moment longer, as if everyone was processing what had just transpired. Then, almost as if in unison, the crowd began to applaud. It wasn't a cheer for a politician or a policy. It was a moment of shared humanity, a recognition of the power of faith, vulnerability, and redemption. Lily, still sitting there with her Bible, gave a small but sincere smile, her heart at peace knowing that her simple question had sparked something much deeper than she could have imagined. The room grew even quieter, the only sound now the occasional creak of chairs as the audience leaned in, hanging on to every word. Trump's voice, though still steady, carried an unmistakable weight, one that came from years of unresolved grief and questioning. It was a side of him many had never seen, and in that moment, it felt as if the walls of his carefully constructed persona were beginning to crumble. "I stopped going to church," Trump admitted, his tone heavy with the admission. "I stopped praying. I thought, what's the point? If life could be so unfair, if people like Fred, good people, could be taken away, then what was the purpose of it all?" Lily sat silently, her small hands still clutching the worn leather Bible, as though it was the only thing holding her in place. Her eyes, though young, seemed to understand something deep within the weight of Trump's words. She had never known loss on the scale he spoke of, but she knew what it was like to ask the unanswerable questions. Trump paused again, his gaze drifting to the crowd before returning to Lily. His voice softened even further, as though speaking to her alone. "But then," he continued, "something happened. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't some grand revelation. But over time, I started to feel a presence. A quiet reminder that maybe I didn't have all the answers, but that didn't mean the world was without meaning. It didn't mean I was alone." The crowd was still. They were all caught in the gravity of the moment, and for once, the larger-than-life figure of Donald Trump seemed to shrink before them, revealing a man who had been through the same struggles of doubt, loss, and searching that everyone else had. The political persona, the billionaire businessman, the controversial leader, was no longer at the forefront. What stood before them was a human being, broken by grief, but somehow finding the strength to rebuild. "It took me a long time to come back," Trump confessed, "but over time, I started praying again, slowly, cautiously. And I realized something. Just because we don't get the answers we want, it doesn't mean the question isn't worth asking. And just because life is difficult, it doesn't mean there isn't a purpose to it all." He paused, looking at Lily once more, as though her question had unlocked something deep inside of him, a truth he had been reluctant to confront. "Faith," he said softly, "isn't about having all the answers. It's about trust. Trusting that even when we don't understand why something happens, there's a greater plan at work. And sometimes you can only see that plan with time." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Trump stood there, his usually brash demeanor replaced by something much softer, more introspective. The audience, regardless of their political affiliations or beliefs, could sense that something profound had just transpired. Lily, still holding her Bible close to her chest, seemed to understand. She wiped away the last of her tears and gave Trump a small, knowing smile. She didn't have the answers either, but in that moment, they both seemed to share a quiet understanding, a shared belief that, despite the uncertainties of life, there was always something worth holding on to. That I was wasting time being angry. I was letting it consume me, and in doing so, I was forgetting the very things Fred had taught me through his life, his kindness, his joy, his unwavering belief that life, despite its hardships, was still worth living. He wanted me to carry on. He wanted me to keep going, to do the work I had to do, not just for myself, but for the people around me. Trump took another deep breath, his hands now resting on the podium as if gathering strength from the wood beneath him. The crowd remained motionless, hanging on every word, captivated by this rare glimpse into a side of him that was completely unguarded. And that's when I realized something powerful, he continued, his voice softer but filled with a kind of reverence. That God, faith, it's not just about understanding everything. It's about believing that there's something bigger than ourselves, something that can help us keep moving forward even when we don't have all the answers. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, and for a moment, it felt like he was speaking to each person individually, not as a politician, but as a human being, vulnerable and honest. Fred may be gone, he said slowly, but his spirit, his message is still here. It's in every person who chooses to live with kindness, to live with purpose, and it's in every question we ask, like the one Lily asked tonight. Lily, sitting in the front row, felt the weight of his words. The tears had stopped, but there was a deep sense of peace in her heart. She had found what she had been looking for, not just in the question, but in the answer that had come from the most unlikely of places. From a man who, despite everything he had built, had been just as lost and uncertain as anyone else. Trump's gaze softened as he looked back at her, and this time, there was no hint of the usual bravado. Instead, there was a genuine warmth in his expression. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've reminded me, and all of us, what really matters." The room remained silent for a long moment, not out of discomfort, but because they all knew they had just witnessed something rare. It wasn't a politician giving a speech. It wasn't a rally filled with cheers and slogans. It was a moment of connection, of vulnerability, of shared humanity. And in that silence, there was understanding. Lily smiled, her small frame glowing with the quiet strength of someone who had asked the right question at the right time. The applause that followed was slow at first, almost hesitant, as though the audience was still processing the depth of what they had just experienced. But as the minutes passed, the clapping grew louder, stronger, a collective expression of gratitude, not just for the question that had been asked, but for the answer that had been given. Instead, a smile tugged at the corners of her lips, a quiet understanding settling in her heart. She had heard the answer she had been waiting for, not just from the man in front of her, but from the moment itself. In his vulnerability, Trump had shared something far greater than a political ideology or a policy. He had shared a truth about life, about faith, and about the human spirit. The crowd, moved by the raw honesty that had filled the room, sat in a reflective silence. It wasn't just about the question anymore. It was about the connection they all felt, the realization that in that moment, they had been part of something real and deeply personal. Trump, sensing the shift in the room, straightened up. His usual confidence began to return, but it was tempered with a newfound humility. He looked at Lily one more time, his voice now firmer, carrying the weight of his words. "You've taught me something tonight," he said. and I hope we all remember it. God is in the moments that challenge us, the moments that make us doubt, and the moments that force us to grow. And He's always there, even when we can't see Him. Lily's heart swelled, the weight of the evening settling into her chest. It wasn't just a question she had asked. It was a lesson, both for herself and for everyone who had been listening. In a world full of noise and distractions, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is ask the questions that matter, the questions that bring us closer to what truly defines us. As the room erupted into applause once more, Lily felt a quiet strength within her. She had asked, and she had received not just an answer, but a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Trump's gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer before he turned back to the audience, his usual energy returning. But something was different now. Something subtle but powerful had shifted. And for that brief moment, Lily knew she had made a difference not just for herself, but for everyone in that room. And never think twice about, but in that moment, there was something about the way he stood, something deliberate in the way he held himself, that commanded attention. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, as though shaped by decades of toil and hardship. "Mr. Trump," the man began, his tone serious but not confrontational. "You said that faith is about trust, even when we don't understand. But what about when the world keeps knocking you down? When you try, but the doors stay closed and the answers never come? How do you keep trusting then?" The room seemed to breathe in unison, as if holding its collective breath. It was a question that lingered in the air, a question everyone in that room had asked at some point in their lives. The weight of it hung heavily, and for a moment, even Trump himself seemed taken aback. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the man, then around the room. It was clear that this was not just a question directed at him. It was a question for everyone, a question that cut to the core of the human experience. Trump shifted slightly, his usual bravado momentarily absent. He didn't answer immediately, as though carefully considering the words that might be worthy of such a question. The room waited. The air was thick with expectation. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "You're right," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Life doesn't always go the way we want it to. There are moments when the world feels like it's against you, when every door feels locked, and it seems like you're not getting any closer to what you want or need. But that's where faith comes in. It's in those moments, when everything feels like it's falling apart, that you have to hold on to something. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, but it's what keeps you going. It's what keeps you believing there's more to this life than the pain and the struggles." The crowd sat quietly, processing his words. Even Lily, still standing at the front, seemed to grasp the depth of the moment. She wasn't just hearing the answer to her own question anymore. She was hearing the answer to a question that lived within everyone in that room. Trump's gaze softened as he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Faith is not about having all the answers. It's about holding on, even when everything around you seems like it's falling apart. It's about trusting that there's a bigger plan at work, even if you can't see it yet. And sometimes you don't see the reason right away. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. The answer isn't always clear, but that's where faith shines the brightest. When you trust, even when you can't understand." The man who had asked the question nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of Trump's words. A subtle shift seemed to ripple through the crowd as the room began to digest the deeper layers of the conversation. Lily, still holding her grandmother's Bible, felt a new sense of peace settle in her heart. The question she had asked was simple, but the answers it had brought out were anything but. She looked around at the faces in the room, each one reflecting something different: curiosity, pain, hope. But above all, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. Trump, sensing that the moment had passed but not wanting to leave it unresolved, looked once more at the man in the back of the room. "Does that help?" he asked, his voice still steady but now tinged with empathy. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his face softening slightly. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "Yeah, it helps." The room remained in that quiet, reflective stillness for a moment longer, before the subtle murmur of appreciation spread throughout the audience. People seemed to breathe a little easier, as though the air had lightened, the tension had dissolved, and for a brief moment, they had all shared something far deeper than just a political discussion. They had shared a moment of humanity, of raw honesty, and of faith. As the evening wore on, the conversations that followed were quieter, more thoughtful. The tone of the town hall had shifted irrevocably, from politics to something much more personal. It was as if the walls between everyone, politician, stranger, and child, had come down, leaving behind only the shared experience of being human. He took a moment, letting the weight of the mechanic's words settle over the room. The crowd seemed to lean in, sensing that this wasn't just another question. It was a raw, honest reflection of something many people had silently carried for years. Trump's gaze shifted, his brow furrowing slightly as he considered the question. "I think you're right," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, as though this conversation had taken on a gravity that none of them had expected. "We've been afraid to admit that we're struggling. We put on a mask, go through the motions, pretend everything's fine because that's what the world expects. But that only makes it harder. It makes us feel isolated, like we're the only ones going through it." He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting the faces of those in the crowd, some of whom had nodded in quiet agreement. "When we don't talk about it, when we don't admit that we're hurting or confused or lost, we make it worse. And it's not just about faith, it's about life. We try to keep up appearances, like we've got it all together, and that only adds pressure. It's exhausting." The mechanic's face softened slightly, his expression a mixture of relief and contemplation. The tension in the room had lifted just a little, the honesty of the conversation breaking through the typical barriers of politics and persona. Trump's voice grew a little firmer, like he was starting to believe his own words. "We all struggle, no matter who we are. Even those who seem like they have everything figured out, they don't. They're just better at hiding it. It's easy to put up a front when you're in the public eye, but the truth is, everyone has doubts, fears, and setbacks. Admitting that we're struggling is the first step in getting through it. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some wiping away a tear, others exchanging glances of quiet understanding. This wasn't the typical rhetoric they'd heard from politicians. It was raw, vulnerable, and it resonated deeply with them. Lily, still standing near the front, felt the weight of the conversation in a way she hadn't before. She looked at her mother, who gave her a gentle, reassuring smile, and in that moment, Lily realized that the struggle, the doubt, and the search for meaning didn't make her weak. It made her human. Trump paused, his eyes moving across the room once again, taking in the faces of those who had joined him on this unexpected journey. "And maybe," he continued, his voice steady now, "part of the problem is that we don't talk about it enough. We hide our struggles because we're afraid of being judged. But that's not the way forward. The way forward is to admit when we need help, to be open about our doubts, to lean on each other. We're all in this together, and if we're going to make it through, we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other." The room remained still, the silence a powerful reflection of the truth that had just been spoken. There was no applause, no immediate reaction, just a quiet understanding that something significant had shifted in the air. The conversations that followed were quieter, more introspective. People left that night not with answers, but with a shared sense of humanity, a reminder that faith, hope, and struggle were things they could face together. Trump's eyes lingered on the man for a moment, as though silently acknowledging the shared understanding between them. He took a deep breath and continued, his tone firm, but thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice gaining strength, The real power of faith is in the struggle. It's in the moments when you're questioning everything, when it feels like nothing makes sense. That's when you have to hold on the hardest. It's easy to have faith when everything's going right. But when things fall apart, that's when it counts. The crowd was silent, every word sinking in. For a brief moment, it felt like the world outside the room had disappeared. People weren't just hearing his words. They were feeling them, experiencing them. Trump's expression softened, a rare vulnerability seeping through the layers of his public persona. Faith is messy, he repeated, his voice quieter now. But that's what makes it real. It's okay to question it, to doubt it. The key is not giving up on it, even when it feels like you're standing on the edge. The mechanic, who had raised the question, looked around the room, his face reflecting the weight of the conversation. There was no smug satisfaction, no political agenda, just a group of people grappling with the same uncertainties, the same doubts, and somehow finding solace in the shared space of vulnerability. Trump's gaze returned to Lily, whose grip on the Bible had loosened further. Her posture had shifted, no longer tense, but relaxed in a way that suggested she had found something profound in the words that had been spoken. She wasn't just a little girl with a question anymore. She was a catalyst, a reminder of what really mattered. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," Trump said, his tone softening once more. "I don't. But I've learned that it's okay not to have everything figured out. It's okay to be uncertain. The real strength comes when you keep moving forward, even when you can't see the way ahead." The man who had asked the question sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of relief and contemplation. There was no applause, no fanfare, just the quiet settling of people understanding something deeper than they had expected to that evening. The room had transformed. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about the human experience, faith, doubt, struggle, and the shared journey of trying to make sense of it all. And in that moment, it felt like everyone in that room had found something to hold on to, something that transcended the noise of the outside world. They didn't have all the answers, but for once, they didn't need them. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Lily spoke, her words carrying a weight far beyond her years. Trump looked down at her with a rare, soft smile, his usual bravado replaced by something warmer, more human. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Faith is like planting seeds. Sometimes it takes years for them to break through the soil. But the roots are there, growing strong even when you can't see them. And you have to trust that they're growing, even when it feels like nothing's happening." Lily nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She was no longer just the small girl clutching a Bible. She had become the voice of something much bigger, something that resonated deeply with the people around her. The room was still, each person lost in their own thoughts, contemplating the simplicity and depth of the moment. Trump stood a little taller, his eyes scanning the crowd as if to remind everyone of the shared weight of their journey and the importance of holding on to the unseen, to the promise that even in the silence, something was growing. "You know," Trump continued, his gaze returning to Lily, "I think your grandma was right about something else too. She said, faith is like planting seeds. But what she didn't say was that it's also about the gardener. It's about you, about all of us. We tend to the seeds, even when we can't see what's coming. We don't know what the future holds, but we trust that our efforts will matter." Lily's eyes brightened slightly, a spark of recognition crossing her face. She clutched her Bible even more tightly, as though it were not just a book, but the very seed of her own growing faith. Trump looked around the room, his voice growing stronger again. "And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson we need to remember. It's not about having all the answers. It's about what we do with the questions we have, the doubts we carry. It's about keeping the faith, even when we're not sure where it's leading." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, more subdued this time, but still strong. People weren't just listening anymore. They were connecting. Each word, each story, was pulling them closer to a shared truth, a reminder of what really mattered. The room was no longer filled with strangers. They were a community, bound by the same uncertainties, the same search for meaning. Trump paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on Lily. "You've made us all think tonight," he said, his voice softer, almost reflective. "Thank you for reminding us that sometimes the most powerful questions come from the simplest places." Lily smiled again, a shy but knowing smile, as though she had known all along that she had touched something deeper than anyone could have imagined. The room grew quieter, as everyone turned their attention to the woman. There was a weight to her words, a rawness that resonated with many. Her grief hung in the air, tangible and unspoken, a deep well of pain that many could relate to but few knew how to address. Trump looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. The familiar political armor he wore seemed to slip away, leaving only the man who had once known loss, too. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Losing someone you love, it changes everything. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, about faith." The woman's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded. "I just don't know where to go from here. I feel so lost." Trump paused before speaking, his gaze turning inward for a moment, as if he were searching for the right words, words that would reach her without minimizing her pain. "You know, when I lost my brother Fred, I was angry too. Angry at the world, angry at God. I didn't know how to make sense of it, how to move forward when the world seemed so much emptier without him." He glanced around at the crowd, as if to remind everyone that this wasn't just one woman's pain. It was a collective experience. But what I've learned over the years is that sometimes we don't get to see the whole picture right away. Faith, real faith, is about trust. Even when you're angry, even when you don't understand. It's about believing that there's a reason, even if that reason isn't clear in the moment. The woman looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. Trump's words seemed to settle in her heart, but they didn't erase her pain. Nothing could. Still, there was something in his tone, a recognition of her suffering that made her feel seen, even if just for a brief moment. "I don't know if you're ready to hear this," Trump continued, his voice softer now. "But I think sometimes the anger we feel, it's part of the healing. It's okay to feel angry at God. It's okay to question. That's part of being human. But don't let it keep you from asking for the help you need, whether that's from God, from family, or from people who care about you. Sometimes, just letting yourself feel it is the first step toward healing." The woman's shoulders trembled as she held back her tears, but she nodded slowly, her eyes still lost in thought. It was clear that Trump's words hadn't provided an immediate fix. Nothing could, but they had given her something more precious, the permission to grieve, to feel, and to trust that, even in her anger, she wasn't alone. The room, too, seemed to exhale a collective breath. It was as though Trump's vulnerability, his willingness to share his own pain, had created a space for others to feel safe in their own struggles. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, but rather a moment of shared understanding, a gentle recognition that we all, in our own ways, were searching for answers in a world that didn't always offer them. Finally, the older woman spoke again, her voice steadier now, though still laced with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. I think I just needed to hear that. Maybe I can't fix everything, but I can start by allowing myself to feel again." Trump nodded, offering a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes that's all we can do. Take it one step at a time. And remember, you don't have to do it alone." Lily, still standing by her mother's side, watched the exchange with a deep sense of empathy. It was as though the room itself had shifted, and the walls that once separated each person, each individual experience, had crumbled. What remained was a quiet, shared understanding that despite the differences in their lives, they were all part of something larger, something woven together by their shared human experience. Trump glanced around at the crowd, seeing how the evening had unfolded. What had begun as a conversation about faith, politics, and power had transformed into something far more meaningful. It had become a space for people to ask difficult questions, to share their pain, and to reflect on the complexities of life that couldn't be neatly wrapped up in sound bites or policy plans. The night wasn't over, but for now the conversation had taken on a new life. A life that was grounded not in certainty, but in the quiet, often messy journey of trying to understand. There was a profound shift, a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of calm and understanding. People were no longer just listening, they were feeling, reflecting, connecting with one another in a way that transcended the typical boundaries of a town hall meeting. The room had become a shared space for healing, a place where vulnerability wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. Trump looked around at the faces in the crowd, his gaze resting on the woman who had spoken. Her eyes were still glistening with tears, but her expression was different now, softer, as if a weight had been lifted, even if just for a moment. He smiled gently, the warmth in his eyes offering a sense of reassurance that words alone couldn't convey. "There are times in life when we all feel lost," he continued, his voice still steady but now filled with a quiet certainty. "We search for meaning, for purpose, and sometimes it feels like we're never going to find it again. But I promise you, it's never too late. Faith isn't a switch you can just turn off, and it's not something that disappears overnight. It's always there, waiting for you to rediscover it." The woman wiped her eyes, letting out a soft breath as if a burden had been lifted. The room seemed to breathe with her, as though everyone was sharing in the small but profound moment of relief. Trump's words had struck a chord, not because they were the answers everyone had been seeking, but because they were a reminder that the journey wasn't about having all the answers. It was about the search itself. "Thank you," the woman said softly, her voice trembling but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. Maybe I've been too focused on the things I can't change, but I can work on what I can. I can find peace again." Trump nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he shifted his attention back to the crowd. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a collective moment of understanding, of people allowing themselves to reflect on their own experiences, their own struggles, and their own faith. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. The crowd no longer seemed like a group of individuals, but a community, united by their shared human experience, by their doubts, their questions, and their hopes. It was as though the room had been filled not just with people, but with a deep sense of connection and empathy. Trump's voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, but no less powerful. "Faith is a journey," he said, "and sometimes it takes a lifetime to fully understand it. But it's in that journey that we find the answers. Not all at once, but slowly, bit by bit. And sometimes we find those answers in the people around us, in the moments we least expect." He looked down at Lily, still standing near her mother, her hands clutching the Bible with a sense of reverence that was impossible to ignore. "And sometimes, the answers come from the youngest among us," he added with a soft smile, his gaze filled with admiration. "Lily reminded us all tonight that faith isn't just about what we believe. It's about how we live, how we treat others, how we show up in the world." Lily's face flushed with a mixture of shyness and pride. She looked up at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. The crowd, sensing the significance of the moment, applauded quietly, a soft ripple of appreciation that echoed through the room. Trump stood for a moment, allowing the applause to fade before he spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet but powerful resolve. "None of us have all the answers, but together we can find our way. We can walk this journey of faith together, supporting one another, lifting each other up when we fall. And when we're lost, we can help each other find our way back." As his words lingered in the air, It felt as though something had shifted, something profound and lasting. The evening, which had begun as a routine town hall, had evolved into a deeply personal reflection on life, faith, and the power of human connection. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that they weren't just in the presence of a politician, they were in the presence of a man who understood the complexities of life, the pain of loss, and the quiet power of belief. The evening was far from over, but the mood in the room had shifted. The crowd wasn't just there to listen to a speech. They were there to experience something deeper, something that transcended politics, transcended the usual promises and rhetoric. It was a reminder that, in the end, faith isn't about finding the right answers. It's about continuing the search, together. It became clear that the evening wasn't just about questions and answers anymore. It was about connection, and what came next would only deepen that bond. The room felt electric now, not with noise, but with a palpable energy of shared vulnerability. People who had come expecting a routine political talk were instead part of something deeply personal. It was as if Lily's simple question had opened a door that no one had dared approach before, and now no one wanted to turn back. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. "You know," he began, his voice firm but tinged with something different now, something almost reflective. "Sometimes we forget that we're all just people trying to make sense of this world. We get so caught up in the noise, politics, money, success, that we forget what really matters. We forget that it's okay to be vulnerable, to ask questions, to admit we don't have it all figured out." The room held its breath. The man who had once built a career on presenting himself as the ultimate figure of strength and certainty was now showing something far more human. "We're not perfect," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But the beauty of it is, none of us have to be. We just need to keep trying, keep believing, even when the road is tough." Especially then. Lily's eyes were wide, but her grip on the Bible had loosened. She felt, for the first time, like the weight of the moment wasn't just on her, like everyone around her was carrying it too. Trump turned back to her, his expression softening again. "And Lily," he said, his voice quieter now, "you've reminded all of us tonight that sometimes the simplest questions can carry the deepest truths. We're all on this journey together. No one is alone in this struggle." The room was still. The air felt thick with emotion as the crowd, who had come for a simple town hall meeting, now stood united in something far more profound, a shared understanding of faith, doubt, and human connection. He said, "There's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones, the times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what matters." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Trump's voice, so often commanding and unyielding, now carried a humility that struck a chord with everyone present. He gestured toward Lily, his expression soft. "This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. And when we live it, we create something bigger than ourselves. We create connections that transcend politics, that transcend all the noise in the world." The crowd sat in stillness, processing his words. The atmosphere had shifted once more, no longer just about politics, but about something far more fundamental: humanity. Trump paused, his gaze scanning the faces in the crowd. "Faith isn't perfect," he continued, "and neither are we. But when we make the choice to believe, even in the face of doubt, that's when we start to understand what it means to be truly strong. Not the kind of strength that comes from power or money, but the kind that comes from being willing to stand in the truth of who we are, no matter how messy or uncertain that truth might be." He looked back at Lily one last time, his voice lowering with a new kind of respect. "You've reminded us all of that tonight, Lily. And for that, I thank you." The room, once again, erupted into applause. This time, it was different. There was no forced politeness, no hollow clapping. It was genuine, heartfelt acknowledgement of something far beyond political discourse. It was a shared moment of humanity, of faith rediscovered, and of people connecting not as strangers in a crowd, but as individuals with common struggles and hopes. Lily, sitting in her seat, looked around at the faces around her, some smiling, others wiping away tears. Her heart swelled. She had come here with a simple question. But in asking it, she had sparked something deeper, something that no one in that room would ever forget. It spreads. At that, Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed from earlier. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's smile widen just a bit more. Trump's tone grew firmer as he continued, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences, but faith. Faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths look. His words hung in the air, resonating with a truth that felt both simple and profound. People shifted in their seats, exchanging glances as the weight of his message settled into their hearts. There was a unity in that sentiment, a reminder that, despite all the external divisions, there was something universally human about the struggle for faith, hope, and connection. Trump looked across the room, his gaze steady. We're all facing something, he said, whether it's doubt, fear, loss, or uncertainty. But we don't have to face it alone. Faith reminds us that even when we feel like we're stumbling, there's someone watching over us, helping us take the next step. The room was still again, not in silence, but in quiet reflection. Trump's voice softened once more as he added, "And when we walk together, when we support each other, that's when we truly find strength." Lily's smile grew a little wider, and for the first time she seemed to understand the full impact of her simple question. It had ignited a conversation that went far beyond politics, far beyond the confines of any town hall meeting. It had opened a door to something more profound, something that would stay with everyone in that room long after the night ended. A ripple of applause began, slow at first but gaining momentum. People stood, clapping, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for the courage it had taken Lily to ask her question, and for the answers it had drawn out of everyone in the room. The sound grew, louder, filling the space with an energy that was raw and unfiltered. It wasn't just a political rally anymore. It was a shared acknowledgement of something deeper, more universal. As the applause began to subside, Trump leaned in one last time, his voice steady but filled with purpose. So tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing. It's about believing. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air. The room was still, every person reflecting on the depth of his message. The echo of his speech lingered, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed. Trump looked around the room, his eyes meeting several faces, including Lily's. Faith, he said softly, isn't always about having all the answers. Sometimes, it's simply about taking the next step, even when you're not sure where it will lead. And that's what keeps us going. The crowd was silent now, not in hesitation, but in a shared understanding. There was no more need for applause. The conversation had transcended the need for validation. It had already connected them in a way words and actions rarely did. And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow and share it with the people who need it most. The room erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. The clapping was punctuated with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories, connecting in a way that only shared vulnerability could create. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope, a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. The evening had transformed them all in ways they hadn't expected. Lily, now standing beside her mother, watched as Trump stepped away from the podium. He walked over to her slowly, the noise of the crowd fading into the background as the moment between them felt more intimate than anything the evening had held before. Lily felt a gentle pull at her heart as he approached, her small frame still glowing with the weight of what had just happened. She had asked a simple question, but she had ignited something much larger, something that had touched everyone in the room, something beyond politics or rhetoric, something that transcended it all. Trump paused in front of her, his expression softening. He looked down at the little girl who had set everything in motion, and for the first time, there was no facade. Just a quiet respect. "Lily," he said, his voice gentle but full of admiration. "You've done something remarkable tonight. You've reminded us all of what really matters. And that's something we'll all carry with us." Lily, overwhelmed by the attention, blinked up at him. Her mother stood beside her, her hand resting lovingly on Lily's shoulder. Trump smiled at the pair before bending slightly, lowering himself to be at eye level with Lily. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age," he said, his words striking a chord deep inside the young girl. Lily nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She wasn't sure how to respond, but she didn't need to. This moment, the quiet exchange between them, was enough. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady now. "Thank you for answering my question." Trump stood up, smiling down at her. "Thank you, Lily," he said warmly, before turning back to the crowd. "Tonight you all reminded me of the power of simple questions, and the strength we find in each other's stories." The crowd applauded again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just for Trump or the question, but for the shift in the room, the shift in everyone's hearts. It was a quiet acknowledgement of something larger than themselves, a shared journey toward understanding, faith, and connection. And as the evening drew to a close, it felt as though, for the first time, everyone in that room was walking away with something deeper than they'd come in with, something that would stay with them long after they left. Lily, her cheeks flushed with the emotion of the evening, glanced up at her mother. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" she asked softly. Her mother smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "More than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." And in that moment, it felt like the whole room was standing together, not just as strangers, but as people connected by something far more powerful than any division. A quiet hope had taken root, and it was growing. Kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye, Trump looked at Lily with a warmth that was rare for him. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." Lily nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, full of gratitude, "for answering." Trump stood, giving her a faint smile, a look of quiet admiration in his eyes. He turned back to the crowd, giving them a brief wave before walking off, his exit marked by the continued murmur of conversation. The room remained alive with chatter, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. It wasn't just a typical town hall meeting anymore. It was a shared moment of connection, a space where stories and struggles had been laid bare, and the silence of vulnerability had brought them closer. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but determined. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" she asked, her eyes searching her mother's face for affirmation. Her mother smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "More than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." Lily's eyes glistened with the understanding that her question had sparked something powerful, something that no one could have predicted. It wasn't just about the question she asked, it was about the change it had sparked in everyone around her. It was about the simple power of belief and the courage to seek truth, even when the answers weren't easy. As the crowd continued to share their thoughts, exchanging glances and quiet reflections, it was clear that the evening had touched something in all of them. A shift had occurred, and no one would walk away unchanged. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Lily asked softly, her gaze lifting to meet her mother's. Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes as she looked down at her daughter. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message of the evening was clear. Sometimes the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. The kind of truths that change us, not just in the moment, but in the quiet days that follow. The evening had opened hearts, sparked conversations, and reminded everyone of the power that a simple question, asked with honesty and courage, could have. Lily, still holding her grandmother's Bible close to her chest, looked up at her mother one last time. Her smile was small, but filled with the quiet strength of someone who had asked a question that had resonated far beyond what she could have imagined. "If this story touched your heart," the narrator's voice broke through, gentle but strong, "take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel." As the screen faded to black, the sense of connection, of shared humanity, lingered in the air. It was a reminder to each person watching and to everyone who had been part of that moment that the smallest questions, asked with sincerity, can lead to the greatest discoveries. As the final words echoed through the room, a profound stillness filled the air. The evening had transformed from a routine gathering into something unforgettable, a moment where vulnerability, faith, and connection had bridged gaps that were once thought insurmountable. People had come seeking answers but left with something even more valuable, a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. "Thank you for joining us tonight," the narrator's voice said softly, yet powerfully. "For more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together, make sure to stay with us on this journey. Because it's in these moments, the ones that connect us on the most human level, that we find the strength to move forward, together." The screen faded to black, but the message remained clear in the hearts of those who had witnessed this extraordinary evening. Sometimes the answers we need are already within us, waiting to be uncovered in the simplest of moments. And as they continued their journeys, each person carried with them the quiet understanding that, despite the world's chaos, there's always room for connection, for faith, and for hope. And so, the journey continued, not just through stories, but through the shared experiences that bind us all together.